Hey guys, welcome back to Bible Fun with the Nuns. Today we're studying Exodus chapter 33. Let's get started.
Okay, Exodus chapter 33 is a unique place for us to talk about Christmas. But just understand that, remember, everything in the Old Testament is really building toward the appearance of the Messiah. So if you go all the way back to the book of Genesis, at the fall, there's the promise of a Messiah. In Exodus, we get a really good glimpse. And the glimpse is that God's people had been in slavery in Egypt for like 400 years. Well, then God sends somebody to lead them out of their bondage and bring them to a promised land. Well, isn't that really the bigger story of Jesus? That we were slaves in our sin. God sent Jesus into the world. Jesus redeemed us from our sin, and we have a promised land called heaven. So when you read Exodus in light of what Jesus is doing, it's a really interesting book. And then you can take the details of this book and they kind of pop with a different kind of life then. Here's what I love Exodus. For instance, when we start Exodus chapter 33, it begins with this statement. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Depart and go up from here, and the people whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt to the land which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, to your descendants I will give it." Now, let's just take the timeline back a little bit. So God is talking to Moses here. The Israelites have already come out of Egyptian slavery, and God says, listen, it's time now that you're out, it's time to go into the promised land. Now, just kind of spoiler alert, they don't really behave or believe, and so they kind of wander around in the wilderness for a long time. But listen to this. So Moses is alive at this point. Well, they've been in Egypt 400 years. Well, before they got there was Joseph, whose daddy was Jacob, whose daddy was Isaac, whose daddy was Abraham. Abraham was told by God that he was going to have a promised land. He was going to have a land and a bunch of kids. He didn't have that. He didn't have his first kid. He didn't have Isaac till he was 100. Now Ishmael came before, but that's a different story. So we got Isaac being born when Abraham's 100. Isaac gets a little older. He has Jacob and Esau. They die. Joseph and his brothers move to Egypt. We're talking hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. But you know what? To God, though, God looks back at this story and he says, you know what? I made a promise to Abraham. I made a promise to Isaac. I made a promise to Jacob. And even though it's been hundreds of years for people, for God, he said, any promise I make, you better believe I'm going to keep it. I love that God keeps his promises. And all as we're preparing for Advent, we're looking at all the promises God made up until then. Now, a couple other things I want you to know that are good here. I want to get to them a little bit later. I'm going to preach the end of this chapter on Sunday, so read it good. John, what did you see in this chapter?
So kind of at the end, it's talking about how Jesus covered Moses' eyes, because Moses couldn't see God's face, because it was too awesome, basically, and his glory was too great for him to see it. And so he covers his eyes until he can only see his back. And what I like about this is how God is way more powerful and awesome than we could ever imagine. Like, I can't imagine what one look at him could do to you. And also, what Daddy pointed out is he said that God knew the exact limit to Moses, and I like that.
Yeah. So what we talked about was God said, you can't see my face. If you were to see my face, you would die. He said, but I'm going to hide you in a rock, put my hand over you. I'm going to walk by and I'm going to let you see the back of me. Why? Because God knew Moses couldn't handle the front, but maybe he could handle the backside, seeing the backside a little bit. So God knew Moses' limitations. Listen, can we bring this in and go, did God know what Moses could handle?
Yes.
Does God know what John can handle? Mm-hmm. Does God know what Daddy can handle? Mm-hmm. Can we trust God to help us with what we can't handle?
Yeah.
All right. Here's my favorite pieces to this story. is when God is angry with the Israelites. It says, and when the people heard the bad news was God was considering not going with his people to the promised land because they were bad. When they heard the bad news, no one put on his ornaments. Now, ornaments are like jewelry, okay? So nobody put on their jewelry. Well, listen, they were just slaves. Did slaves have jewelry? No. So where did they get this jewelry? The jewelry belonged to the Egyptians because before the Israelites left Egypt, they went and asked for their stuff, and they basically gave them the riches of Egypt when they left. Here's what's interesting. These Israelites were out in the wilderness being God's people, but they were dressing and acting like the Egyptians. Right before this chapter, do you know what they did? They created a golden calf, and they worshiped that calf. That calf was an idol from Egypt. They were wearing Egyptian jewelry. So you know what? They were telling people that they were God's people, but they were living like Egyptians. Can I just tell you this? As we go into Christmas, most of us are putting up Christmas trees. We're listening to Christmas music. We're studying the Christmas story. Most of us in our houses, we're setting up Christmas nativity scenes, and we're making much about Christ. Can I just tell you this? We may be talking a lot about Jesus, but we need to be very careful that when people see us, we're also living like Jesus. We don't want to just be talking about Jesus, but dressing and acting like the Egyptians. So as we get prepared for Advent, we need to do a good job of making sure we're living what we say we're prioritizing, which is the arrival of Jesus. All right? So listen, we love you. Keep reading. We'll see you tomorrow. Bye.
Bye.